Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to another night of the Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rebbe Mayer, and let's learn some Jewish history together. So in last week's session, we talked about the depressing facts surrounding the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era in the land of Israel. In the aftermath of the destruction of the Second Temple, we had many other uprisings, rebellions, wars with the Romans, the greatest being the Bar Kokhba revolts, which came to their conclusion in 135 before the Common Era. And after that point, the Romans were basically done with the Jews. They wanted to make sure that no matter what it took, the Jews would not rearm in Israel, that the Jews would never be on top again, because they just didn't trust the Jews to be faithful citizens within their empire. So in the aftermath of the war, they put many laws, decrees, regulations into place to essentially try and squash the Jewish spirit. We mentioned last week that the name of the country is changed from Judea to Palestine. That is where the name Palestine comes from, because the Philistines were the last known Canaanite nation to be in the land of Israel that the Jews had to conquer. And now that the Romans wanted to erase the Jewish presence, they changed the name of the country to Palestine. So Palestine from this point forward was always a name that represents the desire or the attempt to sever the Jewish connection to the land of Israel. That's what the name always means. Okay, one of the other darkest ideas, darkest concepts, darkest really things that we talk about in Jewish history from this time period is something known as the Asari Hurugei Malchus, the 10 martyrs, the 10 who were murdered by the hands of the kings. And these were not necessarily at the same time, they were over the course of the subsequent years after the Bar Kokhba revolt, what we call the Hadrianic decrees, and there are many of the great rabbis at the time who were martyred. Now, why were they martyred? Because, by the way, they're murdered and martyred. Why did that happen? Because one of the things that the Romans did was they made the study of Torah and the teaching of Torah illegal. And not only that, but they made the bestowing of smicha, of rabbinic ordination, illegal. Because again, they're trying to totally stomp out the Jewish spirit. Now, it's interesting to point out that when we talk about smicha in a classical sense, meaning from this time period, 1900 years ago, 1800 years ago, we are talking about a different smicha from today. In other words, the smicha that I have that allows me to call myself rabbi means that I passed the tests in my yeshiva. My Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Aaron Feldman, wrote a nice letter that I can call myself a rabbi. The yeshiva made me sign something that said I would keep to the standards of the yeshiva. That's why I have the title and quote-unquote degree as a rabbi. But in the Talmud and in the Mishnah, when we talk about the concept of smicha, it means a direct rabbinic ordination going back to Moshe Rabbeinu, going back to our teacher Moses. Meaning that when rabbis at this time period that we're discussing tonight would bestow smicha onto another, they had to have a smicha that was received from someone, who received it from someone, who received it from Moshe. So the classical definition of smicha means a rabbinic ordination that goes back to Mount Sinai, literally, that goes back to Moshe. And not only that, but even though the chain, so to speak, has been lost nowadays, I think it'd be a little stretching it to say that my smicha goes back to Moshe, but when we talk about the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court, the rabbis on the Sanhedrin have to be rabbis with that smicha that can be tied back to Moshe. Okay, it's a question what will happen when the Sanhedrin is reinstituted in the Messianic era, how that will be reinstituted, the smicha of Moshe. But we'll talk to that in coming weeks when we talk a little bit more about the closing of the Sanhedrin and the attempts to restart it. So with the Romans making it illegal to teach Torah, illegal to give smicha, illegal to learn Torah, there are many rabbis who get themselves into trouble with the law. In fact, like we said, there's these 10 martyrs, the Asari Hurugei Malchus, who are Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, Reb Yishmael ben Elisha, Reb Chanina ben Trajan, Reb Chutzpah ben Targumon, Reb Elazar ben Shemua, Reb Chanina ben Hakanani, Rav Yashiv Sofer, Rav Yehuda ben Dama, and Rav Yehuda ben Baba. And probably the most famous of the 10 martyrs was none other than Reby Akiva, who we mentioned last week. Now, Reby Akiva, was rags to riches in both a learning sense and also in a monetary sense as well. He went from being an ignoramus at the age of 40, the first 40 years of his life, to 24 years later being one of the greatest rabbis of the time, and having an academy of 24,000 students. Really just a total life transformation in every way, shape, and form. Now, unfortunately, in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt, things go a little, unfortunately, haywire, we could say, for Reby Akiva. Now, one of the things that happens, it's unclear if it happened before the Bar Kokhba revolts or after the Bar Kokhba revolts, but the entire academy, the entire 24,000 students of Reby Akiva's yeshiva perish, die, pass away, in one time period of 32 days that happened during the days and weeks between between Pesach and Shavuos that we refer to as Sfiras HaOmer. In fact, this is why, even though from a biblical sense, just in the Torah alone, Sfiras HaOmer should be a happy occasion. But because we see many tragedies happen in Jewish history during that time period, it becomes a time of mourning as well. And the first great tragedy that happens is the perishing of the students of Reby Akiva. Now, the Talmud tells us that the students succumbed to this terrible end because they were lo nogu kavod zelazeh, they did not honor each other properly, and therefore the divine decree deemed it that they could not live any longer. And the Talmud says that they died based on an epidemic called Askara. They got some sort of, basically like a coronavirus almost, and they all perished within a time period of 32 days. There are other opinions that it might have happened as a result of the Bar Kokhba revolts and the war that took place, as we mentioned last week, Reby Akiva was very involved in. Be it as it may, in this time period, the whole academy is wiped out. Now, we know that we have a holiday called Lag BaOmer. And Lag BaOmer, which is traditionally a happy time, again, now it's overshadowed with the tragedy that happened last Lag BaOmer in the city of Meron in Israel. But Lag BaOmer is traditionally a minor yontiv, a minor holiday on the Jewish calendar. Why? Why did Lag BaOmer get instituted as a minor holiday? So the common answer that's given is because that is the day that the tragedy of Reby Akiva came to an end. In other words, that's the day that his students stopped dying. If it was a plague, it's the day that the plague ended. Whatever it was the end of the decree, and the students stopped dying. So therefore, it is a minor holiday. Now, there's a simple question we can ask on this, and that is that why is it a holiday when all the students stopped dying? You know why they stopped dying? Because they were all dead. There was no one left to die anymore. And how in the world is that a holiday? It's like someone has $24,000 in their bank account and they lose $1,000 every day for 32 or for 24 days, whatever it is. And they get to the last day, they don't have a penny left, and let's make a yontif because the decree's over. I'm not going to lose money anymore. He lost $24,000. So on a much greater sense, there were 24,000 students that all died in the course of 32 days. They're all dead. Let's make a yontif. That's not why it's a holiday. The reason it's a holiday is because what Reby Akiva did next. And that is, think about the life that he went through. Starting at the age of 40, by the age of 64, becoming one of the greatest rabbis, building this great academy, becoming the leader of the Jewish people, anticipating that one of your disciples could very well be the Mashiach, could be the Messiah in Bar Kokhba, and Shimon Bar Kokhba, and then the whole thing crumbling, all 24,000 students dying, the academy shutting down, the messianic pretensions of Bar Kokhba turn out to be false, great war, 500,000 Jews killed. This is everything he went through. Would anybody have faulted Reby Akiva if at this point in circa the year, 138, 139, 140, wherever we're at this point? I'm sorry, we're probably, whatever, somewhere in the 130 years. Would anyone have faulted Reby Akiva if he had said, you know what, I'm done, I'm going to retire, I tried, I built something great, it all fell apart, call me in the nursing home. Would anyone have faulted Reby Akiva? Not for a moment. But you know what, like Lag BaOmer is a yontiv? because of what Reby Akiva did next. And that is that he didn't give up. He didn't retire. He said, you know what? I might be 100-something years old, however old he was. I might have lost everything in so many ways, but I'm going to continue to rebuild. And he rebuilds with 5 students. Okay, before he had 24,000, now he has 5. And his 5 students are Rebbe Mayer, Rebbe Yehuda ben Eloi, Rebbe Elazar ben Shemua, who we mentioned before, Rebbe Yossi ben Charlafta, and Rebbe Shimon bar Yochai. These are the 5 students he rebuilds with. And because he decides to rebuild with those 5 students, the Torah lives on, and we are all here today. Because the whole corpus of Torah that essentially gets wiped out with those 24,000 students gets completely rebuilt, as we'll see, through these 5. But it was done in a time period when teaching Torah, when conveying smicha, when conveying smicha from one to another was illegal. Yet Reby Akiva still did both. And because of that, he is someone rats on him to the Romans. He is caught, he's arrested, he's sentenced to death. And he is taken out to death in a most brutal way, where he has his skin literally raked off from him. And his students are there witnessing it. It took place in the city of Caesarea, which was the Roman Greek stronghold in the land of Israel. If you've ever been there, there's that area called the Hippodrome, where they would have chariot races and whatnot. That's where Reby Akiva was assassinated. And they're literally raking off his skin first thing in the morning. And what's Reby Akiva doing? He's saying the Shema. And his students say to him, Rebbe, like Ad Khan, we know you're a tzaddik, we know you're a great scholar, we know you have tremendous faith in the Almighty, but here, the Romans are literally torturing you to death. And you are saying the Shema, you're saying the anthem of the Jewish people, you're saying your declaration and your belief to the Almighty, like Ad Khan, you're that great? To which Reby Akiva responds, my students, all my life, I have struggled with the words of the Shema. You should love Hashem your God, b'chol levavecha, u'v'chol nafshecha, u'v'chol ma'odecha. I knew that I loved Hashem with all my heart. I knew that I loved Hashem with all my possessions. But I always wondered, if I had the opportunity to love Hashem with my entire being, with my entire life, would I do it? And now that I have the opportunity to prove it to myself and to the Almighty, I'm going to give up on the opportunity? Absolutely not. And he says the words of the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And with the saying of the word Echad, his soul leaves his body and goes straight to the world to come. And that is the unfortunate end that Reby Akiva meets somewhere probably around the year 134, 135, after the Bar Kokhba revolts. But that's the situation in the land of Israel afterwards. So we go from one dark moment to another, a few little highs we saw, but really from the time of the First Roman War in the year, starting in the year 66 until this time period, the year 135, there's been a few ups, but mostly downs at this time period. Now, we're going to see that things start to turn up ever so slightly in the year 138. What happens in the year 138? Thank God, Hadrian passes away. And that essentially, now it doesn't immediately bring an end to his terrible decrees in the land of Israel, but the next emperor, whose name is Antoninus Pius, does start at least reviewing the laws that Hadrian had put into place, and slowly but surely they are uplifted. In fact, we are told that Reb Shimon bar Yochai, one of the students of Reby Akiva, makes a trip to Rome in the area of probably around 140, 145, and he appeals to the Roman government to allow the Sanhedrin to come out of hiding. So from the time of Bar Kokhba, and really from the time of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, most of the time it come out a little bit, come back. The Sanhedrin had been essentially disbanded and hiding, operated in hiding. Now Reb Shimon bar Yochai appeals to Rome, and they grant him and they grant the Jews the ability for the Sanhedrin to be reconstituted. Okay, so we have things looking up. We have Antoninus Pius slowly but surely removing the decrees of Hadrian. We have permission for the Sanhedrin to go back into effect, into action. But again, it's not great. We're going to see that there are still many anti-Semitic decrees on the books, and even the allowances that the Jews are given are only given with a very, very carefully strict watch eye of the Roman officers in Israel, and any slight potential sign of rebellion or even saying something negative against the Romans can land you in jail, can land you with a death sentence, and that's actually what happens with Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, who we just mentioned. So you have this great rabbi, one of the 5 students of Reby Akiva, goes to Rome, appeals on behalf of the Jews, is granted his appeal, but then later on, he's overheard saying something about the Romans that's interpreted as being not too positive, and he has to go into hiding. That's the situation. We'll get to that in a moment, but that's the situation we have in the land of Israel at this time. So during this time period, even though the Sanhedrin is, so to speak, allowed to function again, we're going to see not so simple. We're going to see it still has to travel around a lot. We're going to see it still comes under a lot of scrutiny of the Romans, and there is still great concern. So while things have gotten slightly better, they are not what we would call perfect. So the Sanhedrin will move from Shfaram to Beis Sha'arim, Tzipori, Tiberia. It is the Jewish population at this point, because they've been completely kicked out of Jerusalem. Jews are not allowed anywhere near the city. They're not allowed in the city, except for on Tisha B'Av, by the way. They don't go back to Yavne at this point. The Jewish population in Israel is strictly in the north. So when we visit today cities like Tiberia and Sfas and Amuka and these different places where we have tradition that all of the rabbis in the summer are buried, that's because that's where the population lived at this time. So these were like some of the main cities, as we said, Shfaram, Beis Sha'arim, Tzipori, Tiberia, and that's where the Jewish community was. Now, let's take a moment to talk about some of the great rabbis that lived at this time. First of all, we're gonna delve into at least 2 of these students of Reby Akiva. So one was a rabbi by the name of Rebbe Mayer. Now Rebbe Mayer is really a fascinating person who lives a completely tumultuous life. Rebbe Mayer is one of the 2 heads of the Sanhedrin at this time. As we said, he's one of the 5 students who got smicha from Reby Akiva, and he himself is, besides Reby Akiva, is a student of somebody named Elisha ben Avuya. Now, if you are wondering who Elisha ben Avuya is, you might have heard of a famous, or I would say an infamous book by the name of As a Driven Leaf, or Driven Leaf, by I think Milton Steinberg was the name of the author, and that is a representation of Elisha ben Avuya. Elisha ben Avuya was a great rabbi who the Talmud says, by the way, it's not an accurate representation, it's not a very good book, but it is a representation nonetheless. Now, Rav Elisha ben Avuya was a very great rabbi who, we're told, he, as one of the 4 rabbis who entered, was called the Pardes, meaning he delved to the deepest levels of Kabbalistic learning, and he basically came out a heretic. We're told the 4 great rabbis at the time did this. One was Reby Akiva, who we mentioned before. One was Ben Zoma. There's one other, I'm blanking on the name right now, but it basically says that Reby Akiva is the only one who came out unscathed. One went crazy, one killed himself, and one became a heretic. The one who became a heretic was Rav Elisha ben Avuya. Now, Rav Elisha ben Avuya was one of the teachers of Rebbe Mayer. So just to give you a picture of what type of personality Rebbe Mayer was, is that even after Rav Elisha ben Avuya becomes a heretic, we see that Rebbe Mayer still studies from him. Now, he doesn't study the heresy from him, but he still studies the Torah ideas from him. In fact, there's a fascinating story in the Talmud that tells us that Rebbe Mayer and Rav Elisha ben Avuya were studying on Shabbos, and Rav Elisha ben Avuya was riding his horse, which is illegal on Shabbos, and Rebbe Mayer was walking next to him. And they get to the Tichum, to the Shabbos boundary, to the furthest point in the town that a person's allowed to walk on Shabbos, and Rebbe Mayer encourages him to not go past the Tichum and to return back to Judaism. He doesn't accept, but like, imagine the situation for a minute. Imagine you have the great scholar who abandons Judaism, and but he has students who still want to learn from the wisdom that he had acquired. So they taught him in learning on Shabbos while he's driving down the street in his car, and they're walking next to him on the sidewalk with the window rolled down, talking to him. That's the picture here of Rebbe Mayer and his Rebbe, Rav Elisha ben Avuya. So it's quite an interesting picture, to say the least. Now, it's interesting that quite often in the Mishnah, Rebbe Mayer is referred to by a strange name of Acherim, which literally translates as others. But we have a tradition that always refers to Rebbe Mayer. Now, why was Rebbe Mayer referred to as Acherim? That's because every time Rebbe Elisha ben Avuya is quoted in the Mishnah or in the Talmud, he is referred to as Acher, the other guy. As if to say, because he became a heretic, they wanted to quote his ideas from before his heresy, but they didn't want to quote him by name, so he's referred to as Acher, the other guy. And as a little bit of a, I don't know if it's a shtuch or a little bit of a pech and bunim or whatever you want to call it, to Rebbe Mayer for still learning from Rebbe Elisha ben Avuya, even after he became heretic, sometimes in the Mishnah, Rebbe Mayer is referred to as Acherim, as if to say, like, Acher's guy, the other guy's guy. So it's just an interesting little piece over here. Just another two quick stories to paint the picture of really how tumultuous the life of Rebbe Mayer was, and the culture and the time in Israel that we're talking about. Is at one point Rebbe Mayer's sister-in-law is taken captive by the Romans, and as would often happen, now it's unclear if she was taken captive as a result of the Bar Kokhba War, 13 years before, or it's something else that happened, because as we said, the Jews, even though they were being given certain freedoms, there was still a lot of scrutiny, but she was taken as a captive, and as would often happen to captives at this time, she was taken to a brothel, and human trafficking was a big thing back then. Even as much as it's a problem today, it was much more of a problem back then. And she's taken to a brothel, and Rebbe Mayer finds out where she is and wants to go to try to save her. So he goes with a big bag of money, and he tells call him the Speaker of the House, that he wants to be with this specific girl, and he is taken to the room with his sister-in-law, and he first wants to test to see if his sister-in-law is still loyal to Judaism, so to speak, if she's at least tried to protect herself in captivity. And so he pretends like he's a patron. He's disguised, and he pretends like he's a patron of the brothel. And his sister-in-law is trying every which way to avoid. She says she's sick. She says she's she has wounds and whatever. She makes every excuse in the book to not have to perform for who she thinks is a patron. And once Rebbe Mayer sees she is still sincere, he reveals himself, says, "I'm your brother-in-law, I'm here to save you. I wanted to make sure that you hadn't fallen to a level that I couldn't pick you up from." And he goes to use the bag of coins to bribe the housekeeper, the innkeeper, whatever it is, brothel keeper, with to get his sister-in-law out of there. Now, the housekeeper wants the money, but he says, one second, the Roman officers are going to come here, they're going to take account of the girls, they're going to see someone's missing, and they're going to kill me, so it's not worth all the money in the world. And Rebbe Mayer says, well, I'll give you something to say if that happens, and I guarantee that you'll be okay. If the Roman officers come and threaten your life, say the words, Elokai to Rebbe Mayer Aneni. The God of Rebbe Mayer should answer me, or save me. And the housekeeper says, well, how do I know that'll work? He says, I'll show you. And outside of the brothel, there were a group of police dogs, hungry dogs who were clearly meant to tear people apart. And Rebbe Mayer starts walking over to the dogs. The dogs see him, start running towards him to attack him. As they're about to tear him to pieces, Rebbe Mayer says the words, Elokai to Rebbe Mayer Aneni, right? The God of Rebbe Mayer should help me. And the dogs fall away. Don't bother him at all. The brothel keeper is impressed, takes the money, and sure enough, when the Romans come, threaten his life, and threaten to kill him, he uses these words of the Romans somehow leave him alone, and he leaves the work of being a human trafficker and converts to Judaism. Okay, that's one story of the times. Now there's another story told to us in the Talmud that is very tragic. That really tells us how tragic the life of Rebbe Mayer was, besides all these other situations, that, losing a teacher to heresy and almost losing a sister-in-law. And it's that he had a very tumultuous relationship with his wife. His wife is the famous Bruria, regarded as one of the most brilliant women mentioned in the Talmud. And the Talmud tells us, and they had just a very difficult life. First of all, they lost many children. And the Talmud tells us of a debate that they were having one day on a Talmudic principle Nashim Daitan Kalas Hain, which literally translate as women's minds are light. Now, some at the surface say that, or really mistranslate this section of the Talmud to say that the Talmud says that women are stupid. That is not what the words mean. That's not even how they translate. Nashim Daitan, das means our, one part of our thinking mind. Kalas Hain, the thinking minds are light. What does it mean they're light? It doesn't say they're stupid. What does it mean that they're light? So there's two basic approaches given to this idea. One approach is that women's minds can flow, since they're light, can flow more easily from topic to topic than men can. By the way, this is why typically women are able to multitask a lot easier than men. Men hyper-focus on one thing, that's all they can do. Women a lot of times can freely flow from one task to another. But more specifically, in the case that Rebbe Mayer and his wife were discussing, it means that women are easily seduced. And unfortunately, I don't have to, I hope I don't sound sexist for saying this, because I think you just take a look at world history, modern history, Jewish, any history you want, and there's no shortage of stories of brilliant women, of very upstanding women, of wonderful women who are unfortunately seduced. And not only that, but from the Torah perspective, seduction is considered a terrible thing. Paramount in many cases to rape. In other words, the Torah links the two together. So just like rape, obviously a woman is not at fault at all for having been raped, the Torah basically says that a woman is not at fault at all for having been seducted. If a woman is seducted, she's essentially faultless based on what the Torah says. And we link those two together. What's called an onus, a rape, and a mafata, a seduction. Now, why is that? Because this concept of Nashim Daitan Kalas Hain, that the way that women are wired, typically, we're painting broad strokes, but typically, is that women are easily seduced. And this was the debate that Rebbe Mayer and his wife, his brilliant wife, were having. Now, his wife, being brilliant, said, you know what? Okay, yeah, maybe like an average woman this applies to, but me, I'm the brilliant Beruria. There's no way it applies to me. And Reby Akiva said, no, it applies even to you. And they went back and forth, and she wouldn't accept this fact at all. Okay, so Rebbe Mayer says, I want to prove the point to my wife, so here's what I'm going to do. Again, crazy story. He asked one of his students to try to seduce his wife. The student obviously makes every excuse in the world why he is not going to seduce the wife of the Rebbe, but eventually Rebbe Mayer says, no, it's fine. I'll jump in and I'll stop the situation before anything happens. But you know what? I want to just prove the point to my wife. Try and seduce my wife. Fine. So the student, whoever he was, eventually agrees, and Beruria initially pushes off all overtures and rejects. But eventually the student's persistent, and Beruria is about to give in to the student, at which point Rebbe Mayer jumps out of the closet and says, "Ha-ha, Nashim Daitan Kalas Hain." And the Talmud goes on to tell us that Beruria kills herself. Terrible story, but it again paints a picture of the difficult relationship, the difficult life of Rebbe Mayer, difficult relationship of Rebbe Mayer. Now, based on the previous story I told you, where he makes a miracle, saves his sister-in-law, Rebbe Mayer gets a name, Rebbe Mayer Baal Hanes, Rebbe Mayer the miracle worker. And you might have heard of the famous charity that supported the land of Israel in the second part of the last millennium, basically from about the 1500s to modern times, called the Charity of Rebbe Mayer Baal Hanes. But that's our Rebbe Mayer here. Now, two last interesting, or at least we'll say for now one more thing, and then we'll go on to tell about a few more people to tie some points together. But one other interesting thing about Rebbe Mayer is that if you go to Tiberias today, there's a beautiful structure, a beautiful synagogue built on what claims to be the tomb of Rebbe Mayer Baal Hanes. Is it? I hate to say this, but highly doubtful. There are no less than 4 different places in the land of Israel and 2 in Iraq that there are sources who say are the tombs of Rebbe Mayer. And the Talmud itself says Rebbe Mayer was born outside the land of Israel, even though he requested for his remains to be buried in Israel. It's unclear if that ever happened. So we have no less than 6 different sources, 4 in Israel, two outside of Israel that claim to be, or they claim to know the burial site of Rebbe Mayer. Now, this is really the case with many burial sites in Israel claiming to be that of rabbis from this time period, that a lot of them are on very flimsy tradition. There are those that were actually marked by the Arizal, when the Arizal will come to Israel in the 16th century. So many of them go back to that point. And others are just, honestly, are quite often like a loose tradition, but it's an excuse to make a monument and for someone to make a buck off of it. And I hate to say it like that. And I think that might be what the grave of Rebbe Mayer is. The ones that probably have the most solid tradition that we accept are accurate are the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron and Rachel's tomb in Bethlehem. Beyond that, it gets kind of questionable. Some more, some less, as far as their accuracy, but they can be kind of questionable. And Rebbe Mayer his tomb was definitely one of them. Okay. Another one of the great rabbis we mentioned as one of this is Reby Akiva was Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. Now, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, we mentioned before, is the one who went to the Romans to appeal to have the Sanhedrin reinstituted, but eventually says something that is taken as being disparaging words against the Romans, and he's sentenced to death. So what does he do? He's hiding. Initially goes into hiding just in the Beis Medrash and the study hall, but he's worried that the Romans will torture his wife and tell them where to find him. So he goes into hiding without even telling his wife where he is for 12 years with his son, Rebbe Eliezer, and they hide in a cave. And again, very rough situation. The Talmud tells us that they would bury themselves in sand, so their clothes wouldn't wear out and only come out and get dressed when they would daven. And they studied day and night while they're in that cave, reaching very high levels. According to somewhat of a loose tradition, it was at that time period that they reached very deep levels of what we call Torah's Nister, very deep levels of Kabbalistic understanding, and maybe even wrote a book, Zohar. I say maybe because we have no source saying that's when it was written, but Jewish tradition does attribute the Zohar to Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. So, was it written in the cave? I don't know. Was it written down afterwards, and was Torah that was studied and the understanding achieved in the cave? Quite possibly. We don't know. But eventually, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai and his son are able to come out. They are on such a holy level that the Talmud tells us they're looking around and incinerating the world as they see the world engaging in mundane activities. The Almighty says, I didn't send you in the cave for all this time to burn my world up. Go back in for a year and come down. Then they come back out. The sun's still incinerating the world. Rebbe Eliezer, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai is putting out the fires, and eventually they come to an understanding of how to live in the world again. Okay, so Reb Shimon Bar Yochai is the author of the Zohar. Zohar, what is the Zohar? The Zohar is one of the many books at this time period that is the writing down of the oral Torah. Fundamental Jewish belief is that the Torah, at this time, we have basically 24 written books. We have the Tanakh. The Tanakh was canonized probably at the time of the Maccabees, so those are the only written Torah texts that exist, at least communally. And we have we know that the Torah, and for sure the prophets and the writings, are basically incomprehensible without a companion. The Torah itself basically says it has a companion many a times. Quite often says that that you should you get countless allusions to the Torah had to be given with a companion. We call that companion Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah. Now, at this time that the Jews in Israel, they have a clear understanding that the temple's not going to be rebuilt anytime soon. They can't even go to the south of the country. They can't even go to Jerusalem. They're subjugated to only live in the north of the country. Also, many rabbis have much of the population that wasn't taken as slaves or killed during the different wars has left for Babylon, which was as we always said, was a safe haven for the Jews from its inception, really until its eventual demise. But it's clear that Israel's lost its supremacy. It's clear that Jewish people are in exile, and the exile is going to take a while. So at this time, many of these rabbis come to understand an issue. Now, the tradition is that the Torah Shabbal Peh, this oral transmission, cannot be written down. But they apply an idea called Eis Lasos Hashem Hefirus Orasecha, that sometimes for the betterment of the Jewish people, to save the Jewish people, we have to do extenuating things. And so it is at this time that we see there's an attempt to write down the oral tradition in a national way. So the first mention that we did here was mentioning Reb Shimon Bar Yochai Zohar, which became the fundamental work of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism. Now, that book remains what we call a hidden book for more than 1,000 years. Now, what does that mean? It's a hidden book. That means it is studied, but only by absolutely exceptional scholars, and is never from this point for the next 1,000 years. The next attempt to write down the oral Torah that we're going to talk about was initiated by two rabbis by the name of Reb Shimon ben Gamliel II. As we mentioned before, we have a lot of Rebbe Gamliels or Shimon Gamliels, all having the position of Nasi. Came from Babylon to the land of Israel, Rebbe Nassan. Now, Reb Shimon ben Gamliel II still has the status of many others that came before him. It was like basically illegal to have a Nasi, so it was like an unofficial position. But we're going to say that his son will be the first rabbi, the first Nasi since the Hadrian decrees to basically publicly see, and we'll get to him in a moment. But together, Reb Shimon ben Gamliel II and Rebbe Nassan are the head that is allowed to function publicly at this time. And they began a process in the Sanhedrin of organizing the oral tradition to write it down. Now, what do? What is the form they put in place? Even can be expected to remember things orally, right, without writing it down. So since time immemorial, Jews would keep notebooks of what they would study and to remember things. So what the Sanhedrin does at this time is they essentially start to collect all the different notebooks of all the rabbis that were part of the Sanhedrin, and from those notes, they start to organize something that will eventually be called the Mishnah. Now, the form that it takes in the lifetime of these two rabbis is that they were probably the ones who come up with what's called the Shisha Sidarim, the 6 orders of the Mishnah, which are, if you have the outline there, it's listed on the outline. There's Zrayim, Moadim, Nashim, Nezikin, Kodshim, and Tyrus. Now, those were 6 categories, 6 orders, 6 sections of the Mishnah, and that's how the tradition is divided. So the first section is Zrayim, agricultural laws. Second is Moadim, holidays. Third is Nashim, different marital laws. Nezikin, tort law, damage laws. Fifth is Kodshim, laws pertaining to the temple. And 6th is Tyros, the laws of purity and impurity. So they make the form. They probably maybe even made the different, what we call Masechtas, the different tractates, but they put everything into a form. But it is really the son of Reb Shimon ben Gamliel II, who is known to us as Rav Yehuda HaNasi, who actually redacts the Mishnah and brings it to fruition, circulates it throughout the Jewish world, and makes it the backbone of the oral tradition, really until this day. Now, first of all, parenthetically, we mentioned Reb Nassan. Reb Nassan has a writing in and of itself referred to as Avos to Reb Nassan, which is a book of ethics that he penned from this time period. But the Mishnah becomes the fundamental work of the people as the backdrop for the oral tradition, and it's done by Rebbe Yehuda Nasi. Now, how does Rebbe Yehuda Nasi get this done? It was definitely a project started by the generation before him, started by his predecessors, but we see he's the one able to take it to fruition. Part of the way that this happens is we see that Rebbe Yehuda Nasi also makes a trip to Rome, and he has a meeting with the Roman emperor at this time, other than Marcus Aurelius. And he appeals again for certain laws to be lifted, for the position of Nasi to be reinstituted, and the requests are granted. But more than that, the Talmud tells us that they strike up a tremendous friendship. Now, Marcus Aurelius was known as the Philosopher Emperor because he was a great philosopher. In fact, many consider him the father of something called Stoicism. He didn't create the philosophy; that goes back to the Greeks and to others. But he was definitely one who popularized the philosophy of Stoicism. Now, I'll just point out that in the Talmud, this emperor here, I've given you one or two named emperors, but many of them have like 5 names. And who we traditionally Aurelius is no exception to the multiple named emperors of Rome, but his full name, if you want to get the full name, was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, but he's colloquially known in academia as Marcus Aurelius. The Talmud calls him Antoninus. Okay, so just so when we talk about the Rebbe and Antoninus, because Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is often called Rebbe or Rabbi, and Antoninus, Roman emperor. So that's this guy, Marcus. So they strike up a friendship when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi meets with them, and so much so that since he was the philosopher king, the philosopher emperor, they have many interactions. They almost, the Talmud describes, become like chavrusas, become study partners. Now, I would like to posit that Marcus Aurelius is the father of Stoicism, or the one who popularized Stoicism. What is the philosophy of Stoicism? Now, many people think of, when they think of a Stoic or Stoic, they misunderstand it to mean, well, a Stoic is somebody who's unfazed by anything, and Stoicism means to be unfazed by anything. That's a part of it, really, the philosophy. The philosophy of Stoicism is to embrace obstacles. In fact, Marcus Aurelius himself has a statement where he says the obstacle is the way. It became the name of the famous Ryan Holiday book, which is based on but the concept that Marcus Aurelius would teach, it was to embrace obstacles, to embrace them, not to avoid them, but to embrace them, because growth comes through the obstacles. It's through embracing the obstacles and going forward. And that is the main philosophy of Stoicism. So follow my logic for a minute. We have a concept that comes to us from King Solomon, who is in many ways, as we mentioned back with King Solomon, is the father of the Chachmei Altoona, the Greek philosophy, which became the Roman philosophy, because he had interactions with the Greeks and taught the Greeks. The philosophy mentioned by him in the book of Proverbs, of Sheva Yipol Tzadik V'Kom, the righteous person falls 7 times and still gets up. And as I always like to explain, the explanation of Rav Hutner, who says that it's not a trait of a righteous person that he always gets up when he falls. It's a recipe. It's a prescription for how to become a righteous person. How do you become righteous? When you fall, you get up. You embrace challenges. And we see that is a Jewish idea, not a generation. We mentioned Reby Akiva. This is something that Reby Akiva embraced in his life. As we said, always having a challenge, always getting up. And we have many statements from him about it. We have the idea where he talks about Kol Damid Rachman Tavavid, that everything the Almighty does is for good. In other words, when bad happens, you don't look as bad. You understand it's from the Almighty, you embrace it. And that tradition passes all the way down to Rebbe, to Yehuda Nasi, so much so that I would like to posit that he's the one who teaches it to Marcus Aurelius. That who is the one that makes Marcus Aurelius a Stoic? It is his Rebbe friend, Rebbe Yehuda Nasi, passing on this Jewish tradition of always embracing challenges, and that when we embrace challenges, that's how we move forward in life. So, I'm right, it could be that this idea popularized in the world today as Stoicism is really a classical Jewish idea that came through this friendship. It is this friendship and this probably one of the greatest peace in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolts that Rebbe Yehuda Nasi is able to redact the Mishnah, circulate the Mishnah, and distribute it throughout the Jewish world, in Israel and in Babylon and other far-flung places where Jews might be, because he had that benevolent relationship with the emperor. And Feshi and Chumash describes that the relationship, the time period with Rebbe and Antoninus, with Rebbe Nasi and Marcus Aurelius, that is the idyllic relationship between Yaakov and Esav. That's how it was supposed to be. In other words, we understand that the Jewish people are at odds with Esav, that Esav is our arch enemy, so to speak, and that Rome is considered Esav because Esav had another name was Edom, that's a name for Rome. We understand this whole tragedy that we went through at the time of these Roman wars was acting up against the Jews, but we see at the time of Rebbe Yehuda Nasi and Marcus Aurelius, there was a benevolence that went to tremendous prosperity of Torah learning. And Rashi says that's how the relationship between Yaakov and Esav is supposed to be. So God willing, we will one day soon, once again, see that relationship of Yaakov and Esav the way it's supposed to be, the relationship of Rebbe Yehuda Nasi and Marcus Aurelius happen again in our days. It should happen speedily in our days, and we should all see it with our own eyes. I would like to thank you all for coming. Thank you for listening. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions you might have. I love the feedback I've been getting. Please continue to send it. You can reach me through my website, rabbilandis.com, or at rabbilandis@gmail.com. Thank you. Have a wonderful week.